The pressure chamber had been sealed for 300 years before anyone opened it again. It sat at the bottom of a trench the surveyors had named, with the particular lack of imagination surveyors are famous for, Trench 14. 9 kilometers down, in water that had never once seen light, in cold that would stop a human heart in under 4 minutes without protection. The chamber's outer hull was scarred by pressure fractures that had healed themselves over centuries, a self-repairing alloy nobody currently alive knew how to manufacture. Whoever built it was gone. What they left behind was a test. Not a trap, a test. There is a difference, and the difference mattered more than anyone standing on the observation platform above the trench that day understood. The trial chamber belonged to a species called the Thren, a name that predated every currently spacefaring civilization in the region by a margin nobody could calculate with confidence. The Thren were extinct. Nobody agreed on why. What they'd left behind, scattered across 19 ocean worlds, were chambers exactly like this one, sealed vaults at crushing depth, keyed to open only under conditions so specific that most species assumed they were sealed forever. Dead monuments, museum pieces at the bottom of the sea. Then, 40 years ago, a Varathi survey ship found the activation sequence buried in a Thren data crystal, and the chambers stopped being museum pieces. They became a proving ground. The rules were simple in the way that only truly dangerous things are simple. A candidate entered the chamber alone. The chamber filled with water at ambient pressure, 9 kilometers of it pressing down from every direction, more than 900 atmospheres, a weight that turned steel into something closer to wet paper. Inside, in absolute dark, the candidate had 6 minutes to solve what the Thren had left as their final message. A puzzle built from pressure-sensitive glyphs that shifted meaning depending on depth, temperature, and the mineral composition of the water flooding in around them. Get it right, and the chamber released something. Nobody outside knew what, because nobody had ever gotten it right. Get it wrong, or run out of air, or simply fail to move fast enough against forces that had crushed submarines built by 4 separate advanced civilizations. And the chamber did not open again for another survey team to find a body. There was no body. The pressure did not leave one. In 40 years, 181 candidates had entered a Thren chamber. 181 had not come back. The coalition of depths, the loose alliance of species who governed the ocean world colonies, and who had, by mutual agreement, decided the Thren trials were worth the cost, kept a wall. Not a memorial exactly, a ledger carved into black stone at the edge of Trench 14's observation platform. 1 name per attempt, no species distinction, no rank, just names in the order they went down. By the time the wall reached its 182nd line, most species that mattered in the region had stopped sending candidates. The Varathi had lost 11. The Cathes, whose physiology was better suited to pressure than almost anyone's, had lost 19 and quietly withdrawn from the program entirely, citing what their official statement called an unacceptable ratio of loss to insight. The Omalans sent exactly 1 candidate, their planetary speaker's own daughter, and never spoke of the trials again in any recorded transmission. Humanity had sent 4. Nobody expected the 5th to be a boy who had just turned 19. His name was Milo Reyes, and there was nothing about him, on paper, that suggested he belonged at the bottom of Trench 14. He had grown up in the pressure farming communities off the Mariana Rim, where humanity had spent the better part of a century learning to live in the deep, the honest way. Not through Thren magic, but through incremental, unglamorous engineering, sealed habitats, slow acclimatization, genetic screening for pressure tolerance passed down through 4 generations of people who had chosen, for reasons that made sense only to them, to live where the sun never reached. He was not broad-shouldered. He did not carry himself like the recruitment posters wanted him to. He had a habit, when he was thinking, of pressing his thumbnail into the pad of his index finger over and over, a small, unconscious tell that his instructors had noted and never managed to train out of him. He had applied for the trial 8 months earlier, filled out the forms with the same flat, unhurried handwriting he used for everything, and been rejected twice before the coalition's screening board finally relented, mostly because nobody else had volunteered that quarter, and the program's continued existence required at least the appearance of activity. On the observation platform, 3 hours before his descent, a Varathi liaison named Kessa Vole reviewed his file one final time and found herself doing something she rarely did before a trial: hesitating. "He has no augmentation," she said, to nobody in particular, though her aide was standing close enough to hear. "No enhanced lung capacity, no neural acceleration. His baseline pressure tolerance is standard human, which is to say, unremarkable by any measure that matters down there." Her aide, a younger Varathi named Dessen, glanced at the readout over her shoulder. "His psych evaluation is strange, though." "Strange how?" "Every fear response is present. Elevated heart rate under simulated pressure, elevated cortisol, all the expected markers of a human being afraid." Dessen paused. "But the behavioral component doesn't match. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't hesitate before entering high-pressure simulators. The fear is there. It simply doesn't seem to be in charge of him." Kessa said nothing to that. She had run this program for 11 years. She had watched 181 people descend into the dark, and she had learned, with the particular bitterness that accumulates in someone who keeps a body count, that confidence killed as often as fear did, sometimes more often. Confidence made people rush. Fear, at least, made people careful. What Dessen was describing was neither. She did not have a word for it yet. Milo's mother had died when he was 7, in a habitat breach that took 11 people with her, in the time it takes to say a short sentence. He did not remember the sound of it. He had been 3 sections away, in a schoolroom, with reinforced bulkheads that held. He remembered the silence after, the particular quality of an intercom system going quiet mid-sentence. His father, a maintenance engineer named Rafael Reyes, had not moved the family up to the surface after that, the way many people would have, had not framed it as brave or defiant or any of the words people reach for when they want a tragedy to mean something. He had simply kept doing the work, checking seals, testing pressure gauges twice instead of once, teaching his son patiently, without ceremony, exactly how much weight 9 kilometers of ocean actually represented, and exactly what happened to things that were not built to hold it. "The water isn't angry," he told Milo once, when Milo was maybe 9, sitting on the floor of the Habitat workshop, watching his father recalibrate a pressure valve. "People talk about the deep like it's got a grudge. It doesn't. It's not trying to kill you. It's just there. It's just what it is, all the way down, whether you're in it or not. Respect isn't fear. Fear is what you feel about a thing that might hurt you. Respect is what you feel about a thing that will if you get it wrong and won't if you get it right. Learn the difference. It'll save your life." Milo had not understood it then. He understood it with total clarity at 19, standing on the edge of a trench where 181 people had gotten it wrong. His father was there for the descent. He did not make a speech. He put one hand flat against the shoulder plate of the pressure suit, the way he'd put his hand on pressure hulls his whole working life, checking for something that could not be checked by sight alone, and he said 4 words: "You know the water." Milo nodded once, and that was the whole conversation. The chamber's exterior lock cycled at 0600 local platform time, a hiss of equalizing pressure that took 11 minutes and that everyone on the platform stood through in a silence that had become ritual over 40 years, whether anyone intended it to or not. Kessa Vole read the mission parameters aloud, as protocol required, though everyone present had heard them 100 times. "Candidate will descend via the transit shaft to the trial chamber threshold. Upon sealing, ambient pressure will equalize to trench conditions over 90 seconds. The trial glyph array will illuminate upon full equalization. Candidate has 6 minutes from illumination to submit a solution. Solution is submitted via manual interface, no assistance, no communication with the surface team once the chamber seals. Communication drops entirely at full depth. This is a known limitation of Thren architecture, not a malfunction. The surface team will have no data until the chamber cycle completes or fails. She looked up from the parameter sheet, which she did not need, and which she read anyway because the reading was part of what made this a trial and not an execution. Candidate Reyes, do you understand the terms? I do. Do you wish to withdraw? This was also protocol. Every candidate was asked, at the threshold, with the door still open, whether they wanted to walk back out. 41 had said yes over the years, and nobody thought less of them for it, whatever the wall of names might have implied about those who didn't. Milo looked at the open hatch of the transit shaft and at the dark water beyond it, and he did not answer right away. Dessen, watching the vitals feed from a step behind Kessa, noted the heart rate spike. There it was, the fear, right on schedule, exactly where it belonged. Then Milo said, "No," and stepped inside. The transit shaft took him down through 4 kilometers of ordinary ocean before the water outside his suit's viewport stopped behaving like water anyone from the surface would recognize. No light penetrated this deep, not even the faint residual glow that clung to the upper trench. His suit's exterior lamps carved a small, precise sphere out of the black, and beyond that sphere there was nothing his eyes could report except the occasional drifting shape of something that lived its whole life in pressure that would liquefy an unprotected human being in the time it took to notice something was wrong. He did not look at those shapes for long. He had been taught, a long time ago, not to stare into the dark looking for meaning. The dark did not owe him meaning. It simply was. At 9 kilometers, the shaft opened into the trial chamber threshold, a round antechamber roughly the size of a small room. Its walls the same self-healing black alloy as the exterior hull, faintly warm to the touch despite the cold pressing in from every direction. The threshold hatch sealed behind him, with a sound like a held breath being released. Then the chamber began to flood. 90 seconds. He had done the math 100 times in training, had felt the pressure differential in simulators built to approximate, never fully replicate. Nothing built by human hands could fully replicate what 900 atmospheres actually felt like against a sealed suit. The simulators had been honest with him about one thing. It was not painful, not exactly. It was a weight that arrived from everywhere at once, a full-body compression that made his suit's joints groan even as its internal structure held, that made the water outside seem less like a substance and more like a solid pressing in from all directions, patient and total. At 90 seconds, the water reached equilibrium. At 91, the glyphs woke up. They bloomed across the chamber's inner wall in a color that had no easy human name, something between deep violet and the color of a healing bruise, glowing faintly enough to be visible, but not enough to properly illuminate the space around it, as if the light itself were reluctant to be there. Thren glyphs. Milo had studied every recovered fragment of them the Coalition would let him access. Every failed attempt's final transmitted seconds. Every scrap of translated theory the linguists had assembled across 4 decades of trying. The truth, which the linguists admitted only in their more honest private notes, was that nobody had ever actually translated Thren glyph language. What they had was a partial framework, an understanding that the symbols were not fixed, that their meanings shifted based on the exact pressure, temperature, and mineral density of the water surrounding the reader in that moment. A message that could only be read correctly by someone standing in the precise physical conditions the Thren had designed it for. A message that changed depending on where and how deep and under what weight someone was standing when they looked at it. 181 people had looked at some version of this wall and gotten it wrong. Milo did not reach for the manual interface right away. He stood, suit humming faintly around him, 6 minutes counting down on a display glowing at the edge of his vision. And he did something none of the previous candidates had done, according to the training footage, according to every recovered log, according to the small handful of partial transmissions that had made it back to the surface before the chamber went silent for good. He reached up, with hands that were not shaking, and he unsealed his helmet. On the observation platform, 9 kilometers above, nobody knew this had happened. Communication had dropped, as it always did, the moment the chamber began to flood. Kessa Vol stood with her hands folded in front of her, watching a countdown timer that told her nothing except that 6 minutes were passing, the way 6 minutes had passed 181 times before, ending in the same silence every time. Dessen, beside her, said quietly, 2 minutes. Kessa did not answer. She had learned, a long time ago, not to narrate the waiting. It did not help. At the edge of the platform, Rafael Reyes stood with both hands flat on the guardrail, the exact posture he used checking a pressure hull for a flaw he could not yet see. And he did not speak either. Inside the chamber, the helmet seal released with a soft, mechanical sigh, and water that should have killed him in less time than it takes to finish a sentence did not rush in to fill the space, because it was already there. This was the thing that no candidate before him had understood, because no candidate before him had grown up the way Milo Reyes had grown up. Not on a surface world dreaming of the deep, not in a research vessel studying it from the safety of a hull, but inside it, born to parents who had spent their whole lives learning, patiently, generation after generation, exactly how a human body could be made to belong 9 kilometers down. The pressure farming communities of the Mariana Rim had not achieved this through Thren technology, or exotic engineering, or anything that would show up as remarkable on a coalition sensor sweep. They had achieved it the old way, through decades of careful genetic work, layered atop humanity's own deep-diving physiology, atop the same mammalian dive reflex that let human children survive minutes underwater that would kill an adult, atop 4 generations of selective adaptation that had quietly, without fanfare, without ever being tested against anything like a Thren trial, produced human beings who could survive brief, full immersion at trench depth. Not indefinitely, not comfortably, but long enough. Milo's lungs did not fill with water in a way that drowned him, because his body, and the bodies of everyone in his family line going back to his great-grandmother, had been built, patiently, deliberately, without any awareness that it would ever matter to anything beyond survival on their own small stretch of ocean floor, to treat pressurized water at depth the way a diving mammal treats it. His blood vessels constricted precisely where they needed to. His heart rate dropped, sharply, into something closer to hibernation than panic. The crushing weight that had killed 181 candidates in sealed, pressurized suits pressed against his exposed skin instead, and his body, without him consciously commanding it to do anything at all, simply knew what to do with it. He had trained for this for 8 months, not the trial itself. The trial was a mystery to everyone. He had trained for exactly this moment, the moment he suspected, based on every partial Thren fragment he'd read, based on a theory nobody on the Coalition's linguistics team had taken seriously when he proposed it during his screening interview. The glyphs were not meant to be read through a suit. They were not a language for machines, or for translated data, or for anyone standing at a careful, protected remove from the pressure itself. They were meant to be read by a body standing directly in the water, by skin, not sensors. The pressure differential the linguist had assumed was noise, an obstacle to be filtered out and corrected for, was not noise at all. It was the message. The glyphs shifted the moment his exposed skin met the water, not because the water changed, but because for the first time in 40 years of failed trials, something was reading them the way they were built to be read. Milo felt it before he understood it, a strange pressure behind his eyes that had nothing to do with the ocean outside him, a sensation like a held note finally resolving. The wall did not show him words, it showed him weight. Depth translated directly into meaning, the exact way his father had once tried, clumsily, to explain to a 9-year-old sitting on a workshop floor. Respect is what a person feels about a thing that will hurt them if they get it wrong, and won't if they get it right. 5 minutes remained, then 4. He did not rush. This was the part his instructors would later struggle to explain to review boards who wanted a simpler story. That Milo Reyes did not solve the Thren trial by being fast, or brave, or lucky. He solved it by doing the thing his whole life had trained him, without ceremony, to do. He stood still inside a pressure that could kill him, and he did not panic, and he let the information arrive at the pace it was built to arrive, instead of forcing it to arrive at the pace fear demanded. The manual interface waited at the chamber's center, a smooth black column rising from the floor, its surface patterned with recessed panels that responded to touch. Milo moved toward it with the unhurried economy of someone who had spent years learning that wasted motion in deep water was wasted air, wasted time, wasted margin. 3 minutes. He began to press the panels in the sequence the wall had shown him. Not a sequence of symbols exactly, more a rhythm, a pressure pattern, an answer built from depth and weight in the specific texture of understanding that only makes sense to a body immersed in the thing it's answering. 2 minutes. Somewhere in the chamber, unseen, something that had waited 300 years began, very quietly, to move. 1 minute. He pressed the final panel with a hand that was, by every honest account he gave afterward, shaking. Not from fear exactly, or not only from fear, but from the plain physical strain of holding himself together against 900 atmospheres of ocean, with nothing but a body 4 generations in the making standing between him and the deep. The glyphs went dark. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened. And in those 3 seconds, Milo Reyes, 19 years old, alone at the bottom of the world, understood with total clarity that he might have just become name 182. Then the chamber floor opened. On the surface, the 6-minute mark passed in silence, the way it always did, and Kessa Vole found herself doing something she had not done in 11 years of running this program. She held her breath. She was not entirely sure why. The countdown reaching 0 told her nothing. It had told her nothing 181 times before. And yet something in the readings, a flicker in the deep-sea telemetry buoys stationed along the trench wall, sensors that measured nothing so precise as communication but could register gross changes in pressure and mass at extreme depth, showed something Kessa had never seen in 11 years. Movement. Something large, shifting position 9 kilometers down, in a location where nothing should have been moving except an inert chamber, and somewhere inside it, either a living candidate or the absence of one. "Report," she said, and her voice was not as steady as she wanted it. Dessen was already at the console, running diagnostics with hands that betrayed the same suppressed urgency Kessa was fighting to keep out of her own posture. "Mass reading at the chamber site has changed. Something's opened. I don't—" He stopped, started again. "I don't have a category for what I'm reading." Rafael Reyes had not moved from the guardrail. He did not ask what the report meant. He kept his eyes on the water, the way he had kept his eyes on pressure hulls his entire working life, watching for the flaw, or in this case, for the thing that was not a flaw at all. The chamber floor had not opened onto some catastrophic flooding failure, the way Milo's mind, in the fraction of a second before understanding caught up, had briefly and violently assumed. It had opened onto a vault. Below the trial chamber, sealed for 300 years inside pressure-resistant housing that made the chamber above look crude by comparison, sat a single object roughly the size of a human torso, matte black, faintly warm, humming at a frequency Milo felt in his chest, rather than heard with his ears. It was not a weapon. This was the detail that would occupy coalition analysts for the following 2 years. The detail that eventually reshaped every assumption about what the Thren trials had actually been testing for. It was a seed bank, not agricultural, informational. A compressed archive of Thren knowledge, encoded not in any data format the coalition's systems had a name for, but in something closer to structured biology. Information stored the way a living cell stores information, waiting 300 years for exactly the kind of reader that had just proven it could listen the right way. The Thren, extinct for reasons still not fully understood, had not built the trial chambers as tombs or traps or tests of raw physical endurance. Kessa's team and the 200 analysts who would spend the following months poring over what Milo brought back would eventually reach a consensus that read, in its final translated form, something close to this. The Thren had built the chambers to find whoever, someday, would be patient enough and humble enough and willing enough to stop trying to survive the pressure and instead learn to live inside it. Every candidate before Milo had tried to beat the trench. Milo had simply agreed to belong to it for 6 minutes, the way his family had spent generations quietly agreeing to belong to a smaller, gentler version of the same depth. The vault did not open for strength. It opened for understanding, and understanding, it turned out, was not a thing that could be trained into a body in 8 months or 40 years or 4 separate species' best engineering efforts. It had to be inherited. The return ascent took 40 minutes, and every one of them passed on the observation platform in a silence that had nothing to do with the ritual quiet of the descent and everything to do with the fact that nobody, not Kessa, not Dessen, not any of the surface engineers monitoring the shaft, knew whether they were about to recover a living candidate or a body, and the telemetry, frustratingly, ambiguously, could not tell them which. Rafael Reyes stood at the guardrail through all 40 minutes without once sitting down. When the transit shaft finally cycled open and the antechamber hatch hissed its slow equalization, Kessa found she had crossed the platform to stand directly beside the exit before she'd consciously decided to move. The hatch opened. Milo Reyes stepped out under his own power, suit intact, helmet sealed once more, carrying against his chest, cradled the way a person carries something they understand, without being told, to be more important than their own safety, the black, humming vault. He did not say anything triumphant. He did not raise a fist or grin or perform any of the gestures that 100 imagined versions of this moment, replayed 1,000 times in 1,000 training simulations across the Coalition's history, had assumed a survivor would make. He set the vault down carefully on the platform deck, checked, out of pure old habit, that it was resting level and stable, the way his father had taught him to set down anything valuable. And only then did he straighten and look up at the small crowd that had gathered. Kessa Vol, who had spent 11 years reading the names of the dead off a black stone wall, found she did not have a prepared question for this moment, because in 11 years she had never needed one. "How?" she finally said. Milo looked at her for a moment, and then, unexpectedly, at his father, standing at the edge of the group with both hands finally still at his sides. "I took off my helmet," Milo said. It was, by any objective measure, an insufficient answer. It explained nothing about genetics, or generations of quiet adaptation, or Thren glyph theory, or the 8 months of preparation that had gone into a decision that sounded, spoken aloud on a platform in front of people who had just watched him survive what 181 others had not, almost recklessly simple. But it was, Kessa would come to understand over the following weeks, exactly true in the way that the truest answers often are, not because it captured every mechanism, but because it captured the one decision that had actually mattered. Everyone else had tried to survive the trench from behind glass. He had simply decided to stop pretending there was a wall between himself and the thing he was trying to understand. News of what happened at Trench 14 moved through coalition space at the particular speed that only genuinely surprising information travels. Slower than gossip, faster than official reports, arriving in fragments that grew more accurate the longer people had to sit with them. On Varath Prime, in a research station overlooking the capital's inland sea, an old linguist named Orsa Fenn, who had spent 31 years of her career failing to translate a single complete Thren glyph sequence, sat with the raw telemetry data from Milo's descent for 6 straight hours before she allowed herself to say, out loud to an empty office, "We were reading it with the wrong organ the entire time." On a Cathes trade vessel passing through coalition space, a retired trial program administrator who had personally signed off on 19 candidate deployments, all of them fatal, heard the reports secondhand from a junior officer and did not speak for the rest of that day's shift. That evening, alone in his cabin, he opened a file he had not opened in 6 years, the names of his 19, and read them slowly, one at a time, the way he had not let himself do since the program ended. On the Omalan homeworld, in a modest official residence, a speaker who had lost her only daughter to a Thren chamber 11 years earlier received the news through a formal coalition briefing and asked quietly for the room to be cleared before she reacted to it at all. News broadcasts across a dozen worlds ran some version of the same footage. Milo Reyes stepping out of the antechamber hatch, setting the vault down carefully, saying 4 words that did not sound, on first hearing, like they should have mattered as much as they clearly did. Analysts on 3 worlds spent that first week doing the same thing independently, pulling old Thren fragment translations out of storage and reading them again, this time looking for what they'd missed. Several found it. The framework had been sitting in partial translations for decades. Pressure as language, weight as meaning, a system built for readers who did not stand apart from the water, but inside it. Nobody had taken the theory seriously because nobody had believed a body could survive being taken seriously in that particular way. Nobody except a family on the Mariana Rim who had spent 4 generations quietly proving otherwise, for reasons that had nothing to do with Thren vaults and everything to do with wanting, simply, to keep living where they'd chosen to live. 6 weeks after the retrieval, Milo Reyes stood in front of a coalition assembly for the first time in his life, in a chamber built for species considerably larger and more ceremonially inclined than he was, and delivered what the official record would later list, with characteristic understatement, as a statement. He had not wanted to give a speech. Kessa, who had by then become something between a supervisor and an advocate, had told him he didn't have to make it one. "Say what's true," she'd told him. "That's usually enough." He stood at a podium built at Varathi height, adjusted down as far as the mechanism allowed, still slightly too tall for him, and looked out at representatives from 11 species who had, collectively, buried 181 names in black stone. "I didn't do anything special," he said, and the translation feed carried it flat and even into 11 languages at once. "My family's been living at depth for 4 generations, not because we were trying to solve anything. We just wanted to stay where we were. My great-grandmother didn't know she was building toward this. Neither did my father. Neither, honestly, did I, until about 8 months ago, when I started reading what was in the archives and noticed something that seemed obvious to me and apparently wasn't obvious to anyone else." He paused. Somewhere in the chamber, a translation delay caused a brief lag, a scattered ripple of understanding arriving unevenly across the room. The trials weren't built to find the strongest species. If they were, none of us would have a chance. There are things in the deep stronger than any of us. I think they were built to find whoever stopped trying to keep the water out long enough to let it in. That's not bravery. It's not even really a decision, not the way people are going to want to describe it. It's just what happens when 4 generations of ordinary people decide that where they live matters more than being comfortable there. He looked down at the podium for a moment, and Kessa, watching from the side of the chamber, recognized the gesture, his thumbnail pressing once into the pad of his finger, the small tell he'd never managed to train away. I'd like the vault's contents shared with every species that's lost someone to a Thren chamber, he said. Not just us. Whatever's in there, it wasn't built for one species to keep. I don't think that was ever the point. He stepped back from the podium without waiting for applause, which came anyway in the scattered, asymmetrical way that applause happens across species whose bodies don't clap the same way twice. The response that mattered most to Kessa Vol did not happen in the assembly chamber. It happened 3 days later at the edge of Trench 14's observation platform, where the black stone wall stood with its 181 names, and where an old Kthess woman, the retired administrator who had signed off on 19 fatal deployments, who had traveled 2 weeks by transit corridor to stand at a wall she had avoided visiting for 6 years, knelt slowly, with the particular difficulty of a body that had outlived its own flexibility, and pressed one flat palm against the cold stone. She did not say anything. There was no ceremony to it, no formal coalition ritual being observed. She simply knelt there for a long moment, palm against the names of 19 people she had sent down into the dark. And when she finally stood, she did not wipe her eyes, because Kthess did not weep the way humans did, but she stood a little differently afterward, the way people do when something that has been sitting wrong in the body for a long time finally settles. Kessa watched from a distance and did not approach. Some gestures were not meant to be witnessed up close. Being seen at all was already more than most of them asked for. The vault's contents took the better part of a year to properly catalog, and what emerged from that year of work was not the weapon, or the power, or the ancient technological leap that popular speculation had spent 6 weeks predicting in increasingly Baroque detail across a dozen news channels. It was, in the driest possible technical language, an atlas, a comprehensive survey of every ocean world the Thren had ever charted, cross-referenced with detailed notes on pressure ecosystems, deep water agriculture, habitat construction techniques refined over millennia that made even the most advanced current coalition deep-sea engineering look crude and improvised by comparison. Practical knowledge, patient knowledge, the kind of thing a species leaves behind not because they want to be remembered as powerful, but because they want whoever comes after them to have an easier time of something they themselves had to learn the hard way. Milo spent much of that year not in coalition assembly chambers, but back on the Mariana Rim, in the habitat where he'd grown up, working with a small joint team of Varathi and human engineers, translating Thren agricultural notes into techniques that could, within a decade, roughly double the food yield of every pressure farming community along the rim. His father worked alongside him, when his own maintenance shifts allowed, checking seals, testing gauges twice instead of once, the way he always had. Neither of them talked much about the trial itself, once the initial wave of attention passed. There wasn't, as far as either of them was concerned, much left to say about it that the 4 words hadn't already covered. 2 years after the retrieval, on the anniversary of the descent, Kessa Vol traveled back to Trench 14 for what had, without anyone officially declaring it a tradition, become a quiet annual visit. The observation platform had changed. The black stone wall was still there, 181 names carved into it, but beside it now stood a second, smaller marker. Not a wall, just a single flat stone, engraved with 4 words and nothing else. It had not been Kessa's idea. She had learned when she asked around that nobody on the platform staff could quite say whose idea it had been, which struck her as somehow fitting. She found Milo there, 21 now, in civilian clothes rather than a trial suit, sitting on the platform edge with his boots dangling over the railing, looking down at water he could not see the bottom of even now, even knowing exactly what waited there. She sat down beside him without asking. 2 years of this particular working relationship had earned that much. They finished the second translation pass on the atlas, she said. There's a section about seasonal water temperature cycles that's going to save the Omalan colonies about 40% of their crop losses over the next decade, once it's implemented. I thought you'd want to know before it goes into the general report. Milo nodded slowly, not looking away from the water. Good, he said, and there was a quiet, unhurried satisfaction in it that no formal ceremony had ever quite managed to produce in him. That's good. They sat for a while without talking, the way people do when the silence has stopped needing to be filled. Do you ever think about the other 181? Kessa asked eventually, not because she expected a particular answer, but because it was the kind of question that had been sitting in her for 2 years and had finally worn its way to the surface. Milo was quiet for a moment. His thumbnail pressed once against the pad of his finger and stopped. Every time I take the helmet off, he said, not down there, up here, ordinary days, getting into the shower, stepping outside into the rain. He looked out at the water, flat and dark and endless toward the horizon. There's a second every time where you have to decide whether to brace against something or let it in. Most of the time it doesn't matter which you choose. Water's just water. He paused. Down there it mattered. I think about that a lot. Not the trial, just that moment right before, the choosing. Kessa did not have a response prepared for that either, and she found, sitting beside him, with the wind coming cold off the trench, that she did not need one. Somewhere below them, 9 kilometers down, the trial chamber sat empty now, its vault long since retrieved, its glyphs dark, waiting for nothing in particular, the way it had waited for 300 years before Milo Reyes ever knew it existed. The stone beside the wall of the dead caught the last of the afternoon light, 4 words carved into it, plain and unadorned, the way his father had taught him to leave the most important things. I took off my helmet. Kessa read them again, though she had read them 100 times by now, and found, as she always did, that they still meant exactly what they said, and nothing more, and that this, in the end, was the whole of it.